Welcome to Gospel Tangents Podcast. I'm Rick Bennett. We're about ready to finish our conversation with John and Locke. I really appreciate them spending some time talking about all these interesting schismatic groups and the Kirtland Temple. In our next conversation, we'll finish up our conversation with John and Locke, and we'll talk about the founding of the RLDS Church, as well as some other schismatic groups and their relationship to the RLDS Church. It's going to be a fun conversation. I hope you check it out. Before we do that, I just want to mention a few other things. If you'd like a copy of this transcript as soon as it is released, please subscribe on our website at gospeltangents.com. There's a button right at the top. For $10, you can get a PDF copy of this and future transcripts if you'll just subscribe monthly for just $10 each month. So I will send that to you as soon as it is released. You'll be the first to see that, and you can recap some of these fun events. Also, we've got our Bible for kids on sale. That's just $7 this week, the special price as we open that up. So this is our 1-year anniversary of starting the podcast, and so my kids are the ones who helped me come up with this idea of Gospel Tangents, and this will actually help support their mission fund. So we'd appreciate that as well. Now back to our conversation. But do you guys have any last things you want to share with the audience you can think of that I'm missing?
We've been all over the place, so I don't know. There's more rights, so that's hardly an exhaustive, group. So I didn't mean to be leaving anybody out.
Yeah, actually, there were a few. I'm glad you mentioned that because we've covered Rigdon, we've covered Strang, we've covered why the Brighamites dissolved the first presidency. I thought that was very interesting. Who were some of the other? I think Lyman White had a.
Yes, we mentioned the Hedrichites, and so I mentioned how they came. They're the Temple Lot group.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Granville. So how did he start off with that?
Well, like I say, they were like a branch that. So one of the things that happened. It's hard for us to think about it because we think of all of the churches now as being a very discrete legal entity, and everything is way more real because it's all legal and it has property and all the kind of things. You didn't immediately in 1844 have, like a fully cloned legal bodies or something like that. The church didn't actually have church buildings largely. I mean, the Kirtland Temple is the first building that they built, right, in terms of for place of worship. So it's not like there was like little chapels all over the place and it's like you owning the chapel or something like that. But there are branches that are spread all throughout the Midwest and the East, especially in Britain, and so for a lot of these branches, they're just operating, with their local pastor and their local members, and they don't have it's not the building, they're meeting in a cottage meeting, they're meeting in somebody's house, and the way they are interacting, then they don't have. You can't go to the website. You can't, watching on satellite or whatever, however it all works now, and when you're watching LDS General Conference or something like that. So instead, what they have is the newspaper, so the Times and Seasons, and then they have missionaries and people who are traveling all around, and so they'll go and hit all the different branches. And so when you have a schism, and then there's suddenly two headquarters, it's not that the branch changed much at all. What's different is now sometimes people come from the other headquarters with a newspaper, and so those missionaries, and you might know them, they might be your cousins, so you might have a branch where at a certain point, you've heard that Joseph Smith is killed, you're very sad, Brighamite missionaries come through, they say the 12 are now in charge and things like that, and everyone's like, hey, well, now we got it, we read about that in the newspaper and this kind of thing. And then, a couple of months later, somebody from Voree comes with the Voree Herald, and they explain about how the 12 are in apostasy and why, this and that, and why, and all of the prophetic gifts that have proved that Strang is the successor, and they're like, oh, well, we're Strangites now. And so, there isn't anything in particular that necessarily happens, for the branch. And so, like I say, for the Hedrichites, there are 5 maybe of these branches that are kind of in a cluster around Bloomington, Illinois. I think probably at some point or other, they will have been affiliated with Strang, but at a certain point, maybe when he affiliated, whatever it even means, right? So Strangite missionaries will come through there, and that's one of the reasons why maybe they didn't gather and go west. But at some point or other, probably over polygamy, when Strang goes from being opponent of polygamy to a proponent of polygamy openly, they probably broke with him. And then at a certain point, they are are meeting with the emerging reorganization and deciding whether they're going to affiliate with the reorganization. And in fact, Granville Hedrick is even assigned by a reorganization conference to write a pamphlet about something. Do you remember? Anyway, he's assigned to write a pamphlet. He writes the pamphlet. And they don't all like each other with what it results. Ultimately, they decide not to affiliate. And so his group then decides that it reorganizes itself, and it's the church. And they have, as I mentioned, they had John E. Page, who was one of the apostles or from before Joseph Smith's death, and he, is granting a certain amount of legitimacy. And so once they get, their reorganization going, then that gives them, they ask for revelation and new purposes. And so one of the things that they focus around is they need to go back and redeem Zion. They need to go back to, Jackson County. The end times are coming. This is where the New Jerusalem's going to be. They need to redeem the temple lot, and they go and do that. So they go and move.
So Granville's group does that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So how does because it sounds like he was kind of part of the reorganized church, but it seems like there was...
No, they were considering affiliating, right? So they're all branches. So all these branches in Wisconsin, and ultimately Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, they're sitting around. They don't want to have any of the headquarters at a certain point, because the headquarters leaders have come out and said, well, we're practicing polygamy openly. So they're no longer interested in Strang's leadership off on Beaver Island. They're not interested in Brigham Young's leadership off in Salt Lake. Sidney Rigdon's church is in general collapsed. And so then at a certain point, how are we going to bring this all back together? And so this is the origin of the reorganization. So the branches start to... they pray about it. They fall back on individual personal revelations for the individual congregations, the pastors. They start meeting together. They, as they're thinking about it, William Smith has had a church in the meantime, and William Smith has been promoting the idea of lineal succession. And there has been, I think I mentioned a while ago anyway, there's this sense that Joseph Smith's posterity, one of his sons is going to be the successor or emerge as a successor. They start to regather these branches, and they form kind of a conference organization, which is not any kind of, it's a loose structure, right? There's no corporate entity here still. And so they pass resolutions together in conferences where they say that they're going to wait for one of Joseph Smith's sons, probably Joseph III, to emerge to receive the prophetic calling, and to accept that mantle. And so when that happens in 1860, and he comes to a conference of the new organization, what becomes the reorganization, what becomes Community of Christ, then that becomes something that all these little branches start to get really excited about. And so fairly quickly, then that reorganization draws from all of the different tradition churches, including people who had gone west, who were dissatisfied with what was going on under Brigham Young and in Utah. Many of those people, they had been farmers. They had just been living this wonderful area of Iowa. They come to this wonderful desert that we are here, and some of them think, hey, maybe I should go back to Iowa. And a lot of them did, or some of them got called to go to San Bernardino at some point or other. They built this wonderful city, and then at a certain point, Brigham Young's like, yeah, you're not allowed to stay in San Bernardino. And so it turns out then a couple RLDS missionaries show up a little bit after that, and then all those guys become RLDS. So San Bernardino becomes a big center of the reorganization. So that kind of thing. So all of these different, again, the centers from the different groups, as the different groups collapse, they all start to say, hey, here's this guy, he's the son, he looks just like his father, it's reminding me of the old Mormonism, he's the prophet. And so that's how the Josephite tradition then, which means Joseph III, the Josephite tradition that becomes Community of Christ emerges. But at that point, the Hedrickites, who had never really fully affiliated, they're on their own thing. They decided they didn't go that way. They weren't going to sit around and wait for Joseph III.
So it's not like Granville became a new prophet or anything. He was just kind of a branch president, for lack of a better word.
So he received some revelations, and I think that he was. I think that at a time they did reorganize their church, and he's the president of the church. And I think that they may have even initially. I'm not remembering the details of it, but I think they may have actually had apostles. But then that their structure breaks down by the time. By the 1920s anyway, but then it comes back. So yes, now they have apostles again. So it's too complicated a story.
They do have apostles.
So they do. So they are, so the Hedrickites and the Bickertonites are the two churches that are very influenced by David Whitmer and the Whitmerites, who are now extinct. So that group also continued to exist. David Whitmer organizes a church, and it's a very interesting one, but it's extinct, so we can't spend too much time on it. But anyway, one of the things that he did was he pointed out all kinds of later changes in the church, that he felt were wrong. So he wrote several, like an address to all believers in the Book of Mormon, an address to all believers in Christ. It's quite influential. And so it talks about things like the first presidency and that as being completely not scriptural and that are a sign of apostasy. And so the Bickertonites and the Hedrickites don't have first presidencies. They have 12 apostles, and the 12 apostles lead their churches.
Oh, wow. So. And I believe the Bickertonites don't believe in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah, both of them don't believe in the Doctrine and Covenants, too. Okay. So in other words, all of the changes in the revelations from the original dictation to then the Book of Commandments to the Doctrine and Covenants, they're heavily edited. That to them convinces the Hedrickites and the Bickertonites that means that they're bogus. And so the D&C is not part of their canon. And you can even go to the Temple Church and they'll actually have pamphlets on the changes to it and why the D&C is a fraud for them from their perspective.
And even the Book of Commandments, well, I guess that didn't really exist. The problem was it was scattered, right?
Yeah, well, I don't. Yeah, anyway, the Book of Commandments there hadn't been very many copies of it, so that would be something they'd have to reabsorb and make new. They mostly used the Book of Commandments, I think, as a way to discredit the Doctrine and Covenants,
okay.
Right?
Okay. So Lyman Wight, could you talk about his group?
So Lyman Wight was a leader who was really important early on. So he's general of Zion's camp. He's one of the heads of the leadership in the Adamanayaman area in the West. And it's just because I think because of happenstance that he wasn't actually in the 12 originally, and he's only a later replacement of the 12. But I think in his mind, he's older than Brigham Young, and I think in his mind he seriously outranks Brigham Young in terms of his Mormon cred.
Well, and that's interesting because the original 12 apostles were assigned by age, right?
Right.
So I guess Brigham was the third oldest in the original quorum?
Right, by a week, right? So if Heber Kimball had been born a week earlier, then life would have been pretty different.
So Lyman must have joined the quorum later, and so
yes, he joins as a replacement because he stays in Missouri after Zion's camp, and so he's like the leader or one of the leaders anyway out there. But anyway, he could have, if he'd come back, he could have been one of the people that had gotten picked because he'd been the general of the camp, and if that had happened, he was older, and then the apostles, which became more important later. Anyway, so he had a lot of early jobs that were more important than anything Brigham Young was doing, and I'm sure he probably resented that. Anyway, he had also had a calling within the Council of 50, which was also organized by age. And so again, he was fairly senior by being an older guy, and he believed that he was called to bring people to relocate to Texas. So the Council of 50 was working on all kinds of different potential relocation ideas, but moving to the Republic of Texas, which was not particularly, it was claiming independence anyway. It was claiming to be an independent republic. Later, the United States, in annexing it, recognized that claim as being legitimate. But the Republic of Texas was had received Mormon ambassadors from the Council of 50 and was prepared to give a whole huge tract of land that it didn't actually own, but it was claiming between Mexico and itself in order to create maybe a Mormon buffer state between Texas and Mexico. And so Lyman Wight didn't like the change from that plan. So as far as he was concerned, that was the marching orders that Joseph Smith had before death, and he doesn't need to be told anything different by somebody like Brigham Young. And Brigham Young also didn't challenge him in that way. He just told him he can't recruit any new people. So he was just able to take his people. So he gathered up all the people from the pineries in Wisconsin, and he took them all to Texas, and he formed a very successful colony down there. And so the Whiteite Church was a pretty successful gathering for a while, but they had a couple setbacks because of floods and other kinds of things. And Lyman Wight at a certain point dies. He never claimed to be the successor, and he in fact recognized he was one of the people who had been around for some of these special blessings where Joseph Smith declared that Joseph III would be the prophet of the church, and Lyman Wight really believed that. And so most of the Whiteites that stayed in the tradition actually became RLDS then, or Community of Christ, even though they had been living a kind of high Nauvoo theology, polygamy practice, kind of Mormonism, which they then kind of gave up as they entered into the reorganization. So that's extinct, the Whiteites. So they're gone.
They're gone. Okay. Are there any other groups
that we missed that are around? So the Cutlerites.
Oh yes.
Are around.
Yes.
So and the Cutlerites are down to just a handful of people, but they're very, very interesting. So the Cutlerites, Alphaeus Cutler had been one of the masons of the Nauvoo Temple. He's an older guy, so he'd also been one of the senior members of the Council of 50. He was one of the leaders of the pioneer trek under the 12 across to winter quarters, and there's a part of winter quarters that's called the Cutler's Camp. He himself had he felt a special calling from the Council of 50 to do a Lamanite mission, so to go talk to the Indians. And so at a certain point, again, he was one of the guys who felt that the successor should be Joseph III. So in winter quarters, when Brigham Young in 1847 reorganizes a first presidency and makes himself be the president of his faction of the church, when that happens, Cutler kind of begins to break. He decides he's not going west. He kind of is setting his own course. His personal belief is the end times are about to happen. And if he's going to stay right there in Omaha, Nebraska, or in Council Bluffs, Iowa, then he just has to, sail down the river, and then you're to Jackson County, Missouri, and he doesn't have to. Why would he have to go across the mountains and come back? And so he doesn't. And so instead, they found a colony called Manti, Iowa, and several other little Cutlerite colonies. But again, at kind of a pivotal moment, Cutler is aged, and kind of infirm, and he'd also kind of said that. Maybe that Joseph III was going to be the successor. So when the missionaries of the reorganization make it to Manti, pretty much all the Cutlerites join the reorganization, including all of Cutler's descendants. But some Cutlerites don't agree, and they kind of have a vision that they will find refuge away from all of these reorganites up in Minnesota. And so they go up to Clitheroe, Minnesota, where they make a Cutlerite colony, and then the RLDS missionaries find them, and so they convert about half of them up there, and so then at a certain point they decide that they need to go back to redeem Zion, and so they go there. Anyway, so at a certain point, almost all the Cutlerites that ended up staying in the tradition ended up being in the reorganization tradition, but a small loyal group to that tradition, to the Cutler tradition, are having they have their own church in Independence, and there's maybe 6 members, probably. I don't know. It's about 6. It's pretty small, so it's the one that is, in the most danger of extinction as a result. I kind of sometimes joke that there's 20 anthropologists that are camped out around the Cutlerites. There's more people trying to study the Cutlerites than Cutlerites themselves, and in part it's because they're the only one of these groups that we've been talking about, other than the Brighamites, who, because the Whiteites are extinct. So the only other one that is got some kind of a Nauvoo era endowment ceremony, and theirs is much longer. It's a secret. It's sacred, but it's secret, and they won't tell about it. So in other words, there's too many Mormons, Brighamite Mormons, to not give away the secret. So in other words, the secret's out here. But the Cutlerites have been way more mum, and so as a result, everybody wants to know, what it's like, because it would be another version that has come separately, a separate transmission line from Nauvoo, right? And so people are just, and people love secrets, right? So anyway, so as a result, everyone loves studying the Cutlerites.
And aren't they just down the road?
Yeah.
From
the temple.
The temple, yeah. So, as I recall, I remember Tom Kimball said something about when the MHA was there 7 years ago or so, that they were so excited because they had more people in their church than in years, because they're so small now.
Yeah.
So and I wish we could talk a little bit more about them, but I guess there's not much to know, because they're pretty mum about their temple.
Well, there's not much to know about that part of it, but there's all kinds of other things they're doing. So again, they other early tradition stuff that's important to them are things like United Order things, and so they have a whole bunch of church-owned property there, and they own things in common, they share in common, they're living in church houses together. So there's things like that they're doing that they've maintained that are different from some of the other churches.
Okay, and are these 6 people just really aged now, so there's probably not...
It's like many of them are very it's like if I'm going to use my number 6 that I gave, 3 of them are really old. One is a woman who's older, middle age, and then she has 2 sons that are like in 30 or something like that. I don't know. I don't know. Steve Shields would be able to tell you this because he has the direct contact with them. But I'm just trying to I'm trying to remember from the last time I said, but it's somewhere like that where there's 2 younger sons, I think. And so the idea is, depending on how committed they are to the tradition, is how well that the tradition is sustainable, right? And so if they, it could become their calling, or, and then they would be able to, they get married and who knows what could happen.
Or they could end up like the Shakers and pretty much die out.
That's right. So, or the Whitmerites only died out in the early 1960s. So that was another entire tradition that had continued on, but it's gone now.
Huh. All right. One last question about the Kirtland Temple. Do you know approximately when it changed from this bluish granite-looking building to the white?
Yeah, what happened to the color of the temple? So it would have faded probably relatively quickly from the blue-gray, and then the walls have no footings under them. They just start at 2 feet and away they go, and there's no expansion joints in them, which means that they would have been moving from pretty early, so lots of cracks. So we began patching the stucco extensively in the 1880s, probably even earlier, into the early 19th or 20th century. And it's really hard to match perfectly the color. So for the longest time, it was kind of multicolored, different shades of off-white and light gray. We removed the remaining stucco in the 1950s and replaced it. And then the sandstone around the windows and the doors has iron in it and it rusts. So you get rust streaks that start developing on the building. Wow. So in the 1960s, we start painting to cover the rust streaks. So it's probably only been that brilliant white since the 1960s.
Oh, really? It was kind of grayish white before that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, great. Well, I really appreciate you guys. John came all the way from Toronto, and you were all the way from Nauvoo. I might have to hit you on some Nauvoo history another.
Please do.
Oh, great. And John, I'm going to try to get you as much as I can. You're one of my favorite historians. All right. Well, thank you guys for participating here on Gospel Tangents, and I'll let you guys go.
It's been a joy. Thanks.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks. I'd like to thank John and Locke for spending so much time talking with us here on Gospel Tangents. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. As a reminder, please subscribe on our website. Go to gospeltangents.com, and for $10 each month, you can be the first to receive a copy of this transcript as well as future transcripts. So please subscribe for $10 a month to get that right away. It'll be available in just a few days. February is Black History Month, and we're going to start just a little bit early. I'm excited to introduce Russell Stephenson. He's the biographer of Elijah Abel, the first black man to hold the priesthood as early as the 1830s. In our next conversation, we'll talk about Elijah's early life, as well as ask the question, did Elijah participate in temple ordinances in Kirtland?
Zebedee Coltrane claimed that he administered the initiatory ordinance to Elijah Abel. So this involved the washing of feet, but he said he only did so after Joseph Smith basically pulled rank on him.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure that you like our page on facebook.com/gospeltangents. You can subscribe at youtube.com/gospeltangents. We're also on Twitter @gospeltangents, as well as make sure that you subscribe on iTunes so you don't miss any of our episodes. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some more of our videos. Thanks again.